National debt is the combination of money borrowed by the 36 states, the Federal Capital Territory, and the federal government. But who's doing most of the borrowing, and is revenue generation improving? Babajide Ogusowo is here tonight to share the latest insights on the ease and difficulty of loan repayment in Nigeria. Great to have you here, as always.
Good evening, Amarachi.
Good evening. So we're here to talk the economy and basically money borrowing or borrowing of money. So there are concerns, though, about quantitative easing. Some call it money printing. What are the facts, especially with the situation of debts by states and the federal government?
The most important fact is for the common man to understand exactly what is going on. And there are three ways I would like to explain this. The first is Nigeria's national debt. And by national debt, I'm talking about debts that the country, the federal government and the state owes. Is 33 trillion naira. But that's a big number that the common man doesn't understand. So what is 33 trillion naira? That is the first. In Nigeria today, it's estimated that there are 50 million families like you and I and those of the cameramen and those behind the scenes. 33 trillion naira is an equivalent of 800,000 naira per family. In other words, to make this simple, if every family were to share from this national debt, Amarachi, your family will have to pay back 800,000 naira. My family will have to pay back 800,000 naira. So that is the simple way to look at it. The challenge is how many families today have even up to 800,000 naira worth of assets. That is the first point. The second point is there's some good news. The good news about our national debt today is most of the national debt, going by the facts from the Debt Management Office, 60% of our national debt is in local currency, naira. Here is the bad news. The bad news is based on the facts from the Debt Management Office, as at December 2015, our national debt was 13 trillion naira. As at December 2020, in 5 years, our national debt has moved from 13 trillion naira to 33 trillion naira. In other words, national debt has almost tripled in 5 years. That is the bad news.
So who owes more debts, the state or the government or the federal government?
The summary is the federal government owes more debt when you look at it from the domestic and external perspective. Let's look at the state of states to be able to understand the big numbers. And there are three big numbers that we need to focus on. The first big number is the domestic debt. Today, the federal government, in terms of local currency debt, owes 16 trillion naira. The states owe 4.1 trillion naira. In simple terms, most of the domestic debt, the debt that is denominated in naira, is owed by the federal government. One other way to look at it is 1 out of every 4 naira of debt is owed by the states. From the external debt perspective, that is debt in foreign currency, the evidence from the Debt Management Office shows that the federal government owes $28.6 billion. These figures were as at end of December last year. And the state governments, the 36 states, owe $4.7 billion. Well, here's the summary, and here's the third and most important point where I would like to spend a bit more time on. From the evidence we have today, only 2 states generate more internal revenue to be able than all the other states. Here's what I mean. Among all the states we have, there are only 2 states, Lagos and Ogun, whose internal revenue is more than the money they collect from the federation account. Every other state relies significantly more on going to Abuja to get money than generating internally, with the exception of Lagos and Ogun. So that is the challenge we face today. Every state, except Lagos State and Ogun State, gets more money from the federation account than they generate from within their own state revenue from taxes, road transport, and all of that. That is one of the greatest challenges we face today.
So which states then have accrued the most debt in Nigeria?
You know, if you want to look at it from the state's perspective, we'll perhaps spend all of tonight doing it. But an easier way to look at it is to look at it from the regional perspective, because regional perspective is what the politicians are interested in. Regional perspective is what a lot of talk is going on about right now. And if we look at it from the regional perspective, we look at those two things, domestic debt and external debt. The fact shows for the states, The southern states, I'm talking about those 17 states in the southern region of Nigeria, account for 63% of all domestic debts. It even gets worse. From the external debt perspective, the southern states have collected most of the money. They've borrowed most of the money. 66% of outstanding debt is owed by the south states. In other words, Amarachi, in Nigeria today, the rich are getting richer and the poor getting... And the reason is, you would think it should be the other way, because it's in the northern region that we have most of the poor people. It's in the northern region that we have the infrastructure deficit. So rationally, the northern region should be getting and borrowing more funds to be able to do development. But what we see today is most of our domestic and external debt really is being collected by the states from the southern region.
Would you say, that all that borrowing has reflected on growth in the states?
There's no evidence that the borrowing has reflected on growth, and that's because there are still very few states that are measuring their economic growth based on the gross domestic product. What we really have is those figures. When we talk about GDP, is really looking at it from the national perspective. There's some work that has shown some states that have started measuring their own internal growth. But here's what is important, and if we look at how much states really depend on the federal on the federation account. Let's take a look at the top 10 states that depend a lot on allocation from the federal government. And by dependency, we're looking at how much they totally earn from revenue relative to their internal generated revenue. So for instance, in Bayelsa State, 91% of revenue from that the Bayelsa State government earned last year was from the federation account. Here's why this top 10 is important. This top 10 shows most of the states that rely on the federation account. And among these top 10 states, 5 of these states are in the northeastern region, which means that the northeastern region right now is the most sensitive when it comes to social and income inequality. In the final analysis, let's remember, whenever a man is in love or is in debt, it is the other person that often has the advantage. And so we need to look at how much debt we're accumulating, and clearly to understand that it is not in our advantage for us to use debt for purposes that are not generating a lot of benefit. Going forward, we need to do more cost-benefit analysis as we acquire more debt.
Wish we had enough time to talk about this, but Babajide, always a pleasure having you on the News at 10.
The pleasure is all mine.
Breaking down the figures in plain man's terms.